All right, class. So I got my block cut, and you'll notice that I sort of left some of the red areas here to create kind of like a radiating, I don't know, almost like sun type quality coming out from kind of around the crow's head. And that's sort of a reference to old traditional, like sort of religious art having kind of halos and stuff like that. I'm just hoping it creates kind of a visual texture in the background, that is a little like undulating or has sort of waves. But again, it should be kind of focusing your eyes on the crow. For me, anyway, that's kind of how I wanted the composition to work. So one thing I do need to think about as I'm, now that I've finished cutting my block and I'm ready to print, is how am I going to line up my paper on the block? So this is just a quarter sheet of the Tycozo that Allard sells. You might have smaller sheets than that. I could probably get away with a little tiny quarter sheet, or sorry, tearing this larger piece in half and just having a much smaller border. I have found that I get better prints if I have a larger border, so I'm going to kind of proceed with that. And registering the image to the paper can be a little tricky because it's not thin like the collagraph plate where I can, just have a real thin buildup or have, like something traced on a board that it rests on top of when I'm lining the paper up. I need to, and some of that has to do with sort of just the thickness of the linoleum, which you guys might have an unmounted block. I have a mounted block, so it's really thick. So there's two approaches. One is that I can do real faint marks on my paper that tell me where to set my block, and that's kind of what I was starting to do here. Is just like, measuring the width of the paper, and then doing some simple maths to figure out where the edge of the block should be. Let's do that here this way. So it should be about 2 1/4 inches on each side. There we go. So once I have it, sort of figured out. So traditionally, artwork, drawings, prints should have the same size border on each side. That border can be the same on the top or slightly larger, and then you want a much bigger border at the bottom. And the reason for that is that visually most images are weighted, to the eye. They trick the eye, and if so, I have the same size borders all the way around, it's going to look like my print is falling off the sheet of paper. So I need to be careful about that. And this is probably more than I need, but if I get ink on my fingers and I'm handling this paper, then I have edges, more edge to kind of get inky, and then I can tear that off and still have a really nice, good-sized border. So larger borders make it easier to frame a piece, make it easier to handle a piece while you're printing or while you're just like manipulating it once the ink's dry even. There's all sorts of reasons to have a nice healthy border. If you have a smaller border, that's fine, but I'm just explaining why I'm doing it and what the traditions are for that border. So now that I have this block about where I want it on the page, I'm just going to mark real faintly because I don't want to have to do a lot of erasing. I don't want these marks to show up later and have to, do erasing. Sometimes people will trace the whole block. Don't do that. Just do 2 corners so that I can, when I go to print, I can just see those 2 corners and set my block in there and print it that way. There's a little bit of a trick to that, and I'll get into that later. So I can mark one sheet that way, and I don't need to measure the rest. I can just keep laying one sheet on top of the last, and I can see those marks through there. And there we go. And I can do all my sheets of paper that way. Another registration trick is that I actually had some old foam core laying around. You could do this with cardboard. But I cut some pieces of foam core and I made them alternating lengths. So the difference in length is the same as the width, and they're both 3 inches wide. So I think the longer strips are 16 inches, the shorter strips are 13 inches, and that way I can create kind of an interlocking square that gives me a raised edge and corner for the block. Like that. And so by itself, that's just going to come apart each time. And so I used enough foam core, and again, you could use cardboard so it's the same height as the block, or pretty close. It's maybe just a little bit taller. And to keep it from coming apart now, I'm just going to go ahead and tape. Get the top taped. Ideally, so just flip that up, wrap the tape around it. Oop, lost a little piece. That's all right. I'll tuck back in there. And I'm just going to keep putting tape on it. I think I'll need maybe 3 more pieces. And the tape is just going to kind of stabilize it and hold those pieces together. Oops. And each time I shift it away from the block, I'm just kind of making sure that it still locks tight to the block in that corner. If your linoleum is unmounted, you probably would just need 1 thickness of foam core. And sometimes what I'll do is I'll just lay the linoleum on a piece of foam core and just use the linoleum to mark it with a pencil and then a ruler or a straight edge to cut it down afterwards so that I have, then an angle just like I'm making right now. This is only kind of complicated because of the thickness or the height of that block. So this requires a little bit more prefabrication, but it's a lot easier to lay a piece of paper down on the block and print that way, just like I did with the collograph plate, as opposed to when I'm setting the block on the paper and then I have to kind of carefully flip it over. And I'll try to do both while I'm printing, just for example's sake. But now that I've made my jig, it's kind of like a carpenter square, I just want to measure and mark where my paper is going to go. So again, I'm kind of keeping in mind that this is my top, so I'm just going to go ahead and write top on that. So once I'm inking up my block, I ink it up and I just set this here. Then I can kind of carefully line the paper up to that mark at the top and then the one on the side. Just lay it down and then slide that out of the way a little bit, and then I'm just spooning this and the ink will show through just like with the Collagraph print, and that's how I'm going to print it. So excellent. I'm going to go ahead and get my ink going, and I want to set up just like I did for the Collagraph, where I have some wax paper down to kind of help me from keep me from making too much of a mess. And then I want to go ahead and tape down my plexi or glass, just so it doesn't move. You know, I don't need a ton of tape, but I do want maybe 7 or 8 inches there, so it doesn't slide around or move or lift off, sticking to the ink while I'm rolling it up. So today I'm going to try to print with the Pool Noodle homemade brayer I introduced in the Collagraph demo. I forgot to go back and actually print some with it, so I got that I made.